Hello and welcome. In our time together today, we are going to focus on understanding at a really high level the predictive index behavioral assessment. Excited to be here to walk you through this. And so to give a kind of roadmap for where we're headed, we're going to begin by really understanding what is the behavioral assessment and how do we use it as a tool to think about developing our people within our organization. Additionally, encourage folks as they watch this flyover PI overview to really think about their own behavioral assessment results and think about what level of self-awareness does this assessment provide for you to really understand what needs you have at work, what behaviors you might choose as a result. And then finally, as you watch this flyover, think about how those strengths that you bring that are brought to light by the behavioral assessment, how do they serve you? How are they helpful? And then where are there places where your kind of natural drives or needs maybe require some management, some maybe purposeful change in your behavior? And so with that as our overview, let's start with really jumping in and exploring what is the behavioral assessment. And when we think about the behavioral assessment, we really can think about its ability to do two main things. First, for us to be able to use it to understand how a person likely will respond to their environment and the people that are in that environment. That's going to be the real focus and the ask for your time today as you start to learn how to read the assessment and think about your own results. But the other application for the behavioral assessment is really using it to understand how a person likely will do in a specific role, independent of what knowledge they have about that job, or their skill set or their abilities, instead being able to determine by looking at the results of the behavioral assessment if there are certain behaviors a person would like to choose or would naturally show up with, do those help that person do the job effectively? And using that either alignment, if that's the case, where what they would like to do and what the job requires are the same, or a gap between what the job requires and what they would like to do to predict how a person would do in a role. But if we understand the what, I think the next question may be for folks naturally is, well, how do we feel confident and comfortable using this in the context of work? How can we be able to use the behavioral assessment to understand our employees, to hire? And it really breaks down to three main components. One is that there's a lot of data. So 3 million assessments each year that are collected, and it's all well and good to have data. But then the next question becomes, well, what are you doing with that information? And that's where that middle bucket comes into play. There have been over 500 studies done by behavioral science scientists that suggest this assessment measures what it says it's going to measure, and that it stays largely consistent over time. So we can kind of feel confident coming back and using this year after year. And then the last thing, when we think about EEOC guidelines, we can't look at two different assessments and be able to determine age or gender or race or any of those determinants. And so that's another reason we can feel confident using this assessment in the context of work. So that's the what and the how, but let's go into, well, where does it get its information? How does this assessment really measure an understanding of what people likely want to do at work? And so if you remember taking the assessment, there were two questions. It's a stimulus response assessment where it provides you a list of words that you are then able to react to and say, yes, that word is me, and you checked it, or you said, no, not so much, and you left it blank. So I encourage you, as you look at the screen here, to kind of think, if you were to identify maybe one or even two words that really describe you, what would that word be? So take a second to look through. And as you're looking through, I'll share that supportive is the word that always comes to mind when I look at this list and think about a word that I really feel embodies who I try to be at work. I try to be helpful to my teammates. I try to be helpful when working with and communicating to others so that they understand whether it be PI that I'm talking about or any sort of kind of application of how can I make sure we're walking away from our interaction feeling like I've done my job to make your role a little bit easier. And so supportive stands out for me. Hopefully at this point you found a word that really resonates for you. And likely, whatever that word is that you selected for yourself, you have a positive association with that word. And you likely show up to work and try to choose behaviors that really embody that word. I try to show up to work and be supportive because that's what feels good to me at the end of the day. And so we have these words that likely, again, we try to be at work, but we have no control over whether folks see us at work and say, wow, that person's being really supportive in how they're showing up and how they're acting, or they see that behavior and they give it an entirely different meaning or have a different interpretation. And so I hope that you are seeing that orange, really not so great word that just appeared below whatever you had selected for yourself. And you are questioning or wondering to yourself, what does that have to do with the word I picked? Unfortunately, in having the opportunity to work with a number of folks, when we think about this perception gap here, chances are you do resonate or you do connect with that not so great orange term. Maybe someone has mistakenly described your behavior as being, in this case, if I look at supportive, ingratiating, where someone might think that I'm just trying to build a relationship or do whatever or say whatever needs to be said in order to make that person, like me more, and really just to kind of curry favor. And so hopefully this serves as a reminder for each of us as we think about the behavioral assessment that when we see other folks at work, we want to press pause and really consider, is that person trying to be ingratiating, or are they trying to be supportive because that's what feels good to them and that's how they do work in a way that feels energizing and effective. And we can do that with any of kind of those word pairings that we see on the screen there. And really, this is what the behavioral assessment is measuring. It's measuring what are the words that really resonate and we provide and give a positive attribute to, versus what are those behaviors that we likely see maybe in other folks that we might, without thinking or pressing pause, provide a not so great interpretation to. And so as we continue forward and start to unpack the results of the behavioral assessment a little bit more, really, again, going to emphasize that focus on that middle red circle of self-awareness here, because the more we understand what are those behaviors that we resonate with that stand out as positive, the more we can choose for ourselves whether those are going to be effective behaviors because the people that we're working with see them as effective, or the job or tasks that we're focused on really will benefit from us showing up and being supportive, or whatever our term may be, or do we need to self-manage and choose a different behavior and really do so in order to more effectively engage other folks or engage in the work so that we can achieve results. And that's really why we use a tool like PI within the workplace, is to get business results, but it starts with self-awareness. It starts with knowing how we likely show up so that we can make those informed choices. And so the next question may be, well, why did different folks in watching this really resonate or identify with different terms? And so it gets at this idea that we all have drives that really create needs in each of us that lead to likely behaviors. And so the Predictive Index Behavioral Assessment measures 4 specific drives that we'll get into in greater depth. But I want to start with an example outside of the context of PI, just to make sure we're all clear about what this means. And so if we can think about a drive that we all hopefully can relate to, which is a drive to survive, we might call out that some of the needs that a drive to survive would create would be food or water. And if we focus on food, we have a drive to survive, creates a need for food. Some of the likely behaviors that we would see, so some of those actions we might predict would be eating, right? That's the most obvious of any behavior. If we have a drive to survive, it creates a need for food. So if you see a person eating, if you see me eating, is it safe to assume all the time that the reason that person's choosing that behavior, that they're eating, is because they're trying to meet a drive to survive? Chances are you are shaking your head or thinking no, right? There's other reasons why someone might be choosing to eat. They might be smelling some really appealing food. It might be their lunch break. It might be a social act of eating. So there's lots of reasons we might choose to eat. And so the takeaway here, the point being that we can't look at an action. We can't look at just a behavior and be able to work backwards. That line between needs and behaviors really represents the importance of being able to look at the results of the behavioral assessment and be able to say, okay, well, what does energize a person? What would the results suggest that they likely are looking for at work? And use that to understand how a person would likely choose to show up. But we can't look at just a behavior by itself and be able to go backwards over that line between behaviors and needs and predict. So again, the reason the behavioral assessment is powerful, it's giving us information about the drives and needs that people have, which allows us to understand how they will likely show up. But this assessment does not measure measure behavior specifically. It's measuring those underlying drives and needs that we all have. And so as a kind of quick recap at this point, the behavioral assessment measures motivating needs that we all have. People behave in ways that often get their needs met. And the more we know what those needs are and we're able to get those needs met for ourselves, or to be able to give those drives and needs satisfaction in others, the more people are engaged, the more they feel productive at work, and the more they're excited to go back and do it the next day. So I want to zoom in really quickly, though, on that second point. People behave in ways to get their needs met. There are other almost factors at play that we want to make sure we're mentioning here. The list of what you see here, we can think of as filters that live really on the line between needs and behaviors that are going to shape how people sometimes choose to show up. Everything from their education, their gender, their maturity. Chances are we don't show up to work the same way now as we did when we were 18. We have matured. We've learned that you need to, show up in time. You need to iron your clothes, whatever it may be. But those filters that we're seeing here, they don't change those underlying drives and needs that folks have. And so that's why, even though these factors are, at play and they might shape how a person chooses to show up, we can still look at the results of the behavioral assessment and understand, well, what's going to be the most energizing and encouraging to that person, despite whatever we're seeing here on this list of filters. So with that, let's jump into how we actually read the results of the assessment itself. And so if you're looking at your full report, you'll see that there are 3 different graphs. The top graph is labeled self. This graph is really the one that comes from you answering what words on that screen out of the 86 that you had the opportunity to react to really identify you. And so this is the graph that we can think of as really almost DNA, kind of consistent over time, because the research, right, from the behavioral science scientists suggest this graph stays consistent. It's the next graph, self-concept, that is created by your answer to the question of how do you think other people expect you to show up to work? And so if we think about that question, we might be able to understand why this one has a timestamp of 90 to 180 days, because our ideas about what other people expect from us at work might change. If our manager changes, if our job changes, if our team changes, the people that we manage change. So because this graph has that limited window of application, we're not going to focus in on this one today as we really explore the behavioral assessment. We want to focus in on the one that we can go back to time after time. And so if we're looking at this whole report, though, that bottom graph is called synthesis. It's effectively an average of the top 2. But since we're not focusing on the middle one, self-concept, we're going to ignore this one for today as well, and really zoom in and encourage you to do the same on just that top graph, that self graph that hopefully you have in front of you at this point. And if you have it in front of you, you'll notice that there's a little black caret in the very middle of your self graph. And that really is a critical part of the graph because everything is read in relation to this midline. So if you have in front of you, I encourage you to emphasize that line. It creates two sides to this graph. You have now letters which represent the drives that are either on the right, which we would consider a high drive, or to the left of that midline, which we could think of as a low drive. Now, high is not good and low is not bad. Don't let your brain do that. Don't go there. Instead, when we think about high drives, when we think about what a person actively is looking for, they actively need in their time at work, versus on the low side, we're instead learning a little bit more about what environment they tend to prefer at work and what they might like to avoid. So again, not good and bad, but different information when a drive is to the right versus to the left. The other thing you may notice is that each of those letters, each of the drives are different distances from that midline. Because this is a statistical tool, the distance from that midpoint really matters. And if you have a drive that falls within that first set of standard deviations, so that part that's highlighted now, that would be what we would consider a moderate amount of that drive. So as you learn a little bit more about what that drive represents, chances are there are going to be times where it really resonates and you're like, yes, absolutely. And maybe parts of it that don't ring as true or stand out as being as consistent to your experience. And that makes sense because it's a moderate amount. But the further you get from that midline to where we see that very category, even up to the extremely, predictably, the more you yourself or other folks that have drives there feel it. Think of it almost like a volume dial. And the further you get from that midline, the louder that volume likely is in that person's head. And we can even have, if we are looking through our own reports or that of others, situations where a drive falls off the bell curve, where you have a little arrow pointing either to the right or left. That just means it's beyond extreme. The last situation that leaves us with is, well, what happens if you have a drive like the letter B here that's right on the line? This is what we would consider a situational drive, where it's predictably easier for a person with a drive right on the line to choose to do either what we think of as high B to the right of the line behaviors or low B to the left of the line behaviors. And for this person, when it's right on that line, it's just easier for them to live on either side without it being as tiring, without it being as draining, without it being as energy depleting. Now, we can contrast that to that letter C that we see. It's to the right, which means it's a high drive. If this person had to show up day in and day out and choose really low C actions, low C behaviors, and we'll get into what those mean in a little bit, could they do it? Absolutely, because behavior is a choice. Hopefully you've gotten that at this point. But even if they are able to choose to show up as a more low C set of behaviors, because that drive is to the right, because it's high, predictably that's going to be more exhausting for them, more tiring to have to kind of shift and change from how they would naturally or otherwise choose to show up. So again, right on the midpoint, right on that line, just easier for a person to kind of toggle. So what do these letters represent? I already mentioned they tell us about drives that are the shorthand for each of the four that PI specifically measures in the behavioral assessment. And so what we see here on the left are the names of the drives, the letter, right, that we use to shorthand it. And what we're going to fill in now is what is the need that drive creates. So if you remember, drives create needs which lead to likely behaviors. So let's explore what each of these suggests. So the A drive for dominance, creates a need for impact at work. And we'll talk again about what that means in just a moment. The B drive for extroversion, creates a need for influence. The C drive is the drive for patience, which creates a need for familiarity. And then the D drive is the drive for formality, which creates a need for correctness. So that's just the appetizer, just the teaser. Let's go into what each of these drives mean in greater depth. And the way that we're going to do that is kind of as follows. We'll start by talking about when a drive is high and what information we can get when that drive is high. We will focus on the need, what that person tends to do to get that need, where they focus, and one thing that can be motivating for a person that has a high amount of this drive. We'll then jump down to when it's low And we'll talk about the environment that person tends to prefer and what they likely look to avoid at work. So again, not good or bad, but very different sets of information. We'll end each drive by talking about the gap. What can happen if we're not aware of working with someone on the other side, and maybe we don't press pause and misperceive their behaviors as maybe being not so great or not so positive. So what's the specific gap that can occur for each of the drives? So let's jump in. And starting with the A drive, we said it was the drive for dominance, which creates a need for impact when the drive is high. So again, if you're looking at your own graph, any A to the right of that midline would be high. And the further it gets away, the more likely folks feel what we're about to talk about. So high A folks need for impact specifically on things and events at work. So this drive is all about the stuff. It's all about the tasks. And so what high A folks tend to do to get that need for impact on things and events is really to take things apart. And that can look different in different industries. For some folks, taking things apart might be a physical act, might be kind of taking apart an engine or a computer to see, well, how does it work? And then being able to put it back together with their thumbprint, their kind of improvement onto that physical thing. For other folks, though, taking things apart might be about asking questions, really understanding, well, how come we did it this way? Why is it this like this? How come we made this choice? Tell me more about this decision, so that that high A can understand, all right, I now know how we got here. Now let me put it back together with my thumbprint, my idea of how to make it better. And so the focus for folks that are high in this drive tends to be on the result, because by looking at what happened, by looking at the end, that person's able to say either they put their thumbprint on it, they improved it, they put their idea into it, or they did not. The motivator for folks that are high in this drive is really having some level of independence, the ability to work and really put their thumbprint, their idea, their impact onto that thing in an event. Now, on the low side, if high A's are looking to make an impact independently, low A's are still likely looking to make an impact. The difference, though, is in the how. Likely, low A's are looking to make an impact in an environment that has a lot of harmony, a lot of teamwork. And what low A's are likely looking to avoid at work is really conflict, because conflict is a disruption to harmony and teamwork. And so the gap that can happen here, if folks are not mindful, is all around when do you actually call something conflict. If you have one person that's low in this drive, who's looking for our harmony, trying to avoid disrupting that, they can hear a kind of back and forth discussion or lots of questions about why did we do it like this? Tell me more about that choice. They can hear those questions and view it as conflict. And on the high side of this drive, hopefully those questions sounded familiar. If they're taking it apart, they're taking that thing apart by asking those questions, it might be perceived as there's some frustration or anger towards the person on the other receiving end of those questions. And so hopefully this is a reminder to press pause and think on the low side, right? Is this really conflict, or is this person really striving to get their need for impact met? And on the high side, if a person brings up, that this feels disruptive or feels like we're, in conflict, instead of dismissing that, there might be a chance to appreciate that they brought that forward and to share, when I ask these questions, it's more so that I can get my thumbprint on it. I can understand, how this is working. And so when we think about the A drive, really think about impact. Is it more of a team approach to getting that impact on the low side, or more of that individual approach to the impact on the high side? The B drive is similar to the A drive in that they're both proactive. The A drive is all about getting a proactive thumbprint, taking things apart, getting that person's high A ideas into the mix. The B drive is proactive as well, but the difference is that folks that are high in this drive have a proactive need for influence, not on things like the A drive, but on people and feelings. And so when we think about high B brains, what they tend to do to get that influence is really to read rooms, to scan people, to pick up on body language, tone of voice, all of those cues that allow that high B brain to know whether they're influencing, whether they're connecting with that individual in a way that they would like to. And if so, maybe they keep doing the work in that way. Or if they're picking up that that person is not perceiving them in a way they would like, they're not connecting successfully, they might shift how they show up. High B brains get to set for themselves what they're looking to influence around. Sometimes we describe it as an image of success, where high Bs can decide whether they want to be viewed at work as the most successful HR director or the most successful sales representative, whatever it may be. They get to decide and then use that people radar to determine, all right, I'm connecting, people are seeing me as that sales rep that I'm looking to be seen as, or I'm not. So the focus for high B brains tends to be on feelings as a result, because feelings are information, feelings are data. Feelings allow that high B to know either they're connecting successfully or they need to change their approach. What can be really motivating for folks that are high in this drive is providing some level of positive feedback to this individual, specifically giving them that opportunity to know that they're connecting and influencing in a way that that person that's high in this drive likely is actively looking for, right? That influence piece. And so if high B brains are focused on feelings as information, trying to read people, body language, all of that visual and external cues, there tends to be a talk to think mentality on the high side of this drive, because by talking out loud and connecting with someone, they're able to say, all right, again, I'm on the right path and I should keep doing this the way I'm doing it, or I need to change. And if high B brains are talking to think, the low side of this drive is looking for an environment where there can be more of a shut the door, introspective, I'm going to look through the data first. Because what low B brains are likely looking to avoid at work really is speaking before ready. So if you have one side of this drive, which is talking to think, and another side that's trying to avoid speaking before ready, you can probably guess the gap here. For the B drive, the perception gap is all about communication. What does that look like? Where that high B individual might be more inclined to show up to that person's cubicle or at their office door to kind of talk out the idea, right? That low side of the drive might be more inclined to send an email or a message over Teams. And so how these two folks are trying to communicate may create tension if folks are not aware about why folks are choosing a certain style. So again, no good or bad, but being aware of how someone else on the other side of this drive may choose to show up. And so when we think about the B drive, think about communication, is it more of a, I want to look at the facts and the data, be introspective on the low side? Or is it more of a, I'm going to use feelings information when I go out and talk on the high side? That brings us to the C drive, which is similar to the B drive, and then it's also people focused. It also has an element of the peers and the direct reports and the managers that folks work with. But the difference is here with the C drive, when this is high, it's about familiarity with all those people. It's about having an understanding of who that person is, a depth of knowledge about that individual. In addition to having familiarity with people, the C drive is, when it's high, actively looking for familiarity with process as well. And so when we think about the C drive, what high C folks are trying to do or tend to do to get that familiarity with people and with process is really thinking about, well, what do I have to do first, next, then, and last in order to have a conversation and have a better understanding of the human that I'm talking to? Or what do I have to do first, next, then, and last in order to come up with steps, come up with a process, and be more familiar with the task? So high C folks tend to sort things sequentially in order to accomplish that familiarity with other people or process. The focus for high C folks tends to be on one thing at a time, be it the one person that walks into their office or one person that is in front of them, so they give that full attention, develop that depth of understanding of who that person is, or the process, whatever the task that they're working on, be able to go through the steps in order to go in that order that they have become accustomed to or familiar with. What can be really motivating for folks that are high in this drive is having training at the start of something new or when they're being first asked to do something, but training that comes with simulation. So instead of just watching the video and then asking someone that's high in the drive to go do it, it's let's watch this video on how to, and then practice. Come up with a set of steps, come up with a process. On the low side of this drive, if high C's are likely looking to focus on one thing at a time, low C's are likely looking for an environment where there's a lot of variety, where there's a chance to do a little bit of this, so then jump and do a little bit of that. So what low C's are likely looking to avoid at work really is monotony or sameness. And so if we're thinking about the gap that can happen with this drive, it's really all around time and how these two sides of the drive view time. On the high side, because there's that likely, I have a process, I have the steps we're going to go through, time is often seen as however long it's going to take for that person to go through their steps. So if you're walking into the office and asking someone that's high in this drive to do something, right? They likely have a process. They know the steps they want to go through. And so it might take them however long it's going to take to go through those set of familiar processes. Versus the low side, because there's that desire for environment variety, kind of change it up, time tends to be viewed as much more quantitative. End of the month, in 2 hours, etc. Because I want to set that deadline and then be able to move on to something else instead. Now, you may be wondering at this point, why is this a gap? And the reason for that is we often tend to give to other folks what feels good to us. So a high C manager might trust that a person that's low in this drive has a process and just say, I need this done, and allow that person to take how long it's going to take. And that actually might not provide that low C individual that time deadline, that urgency that they might be looking for. And we can flip that and think of the inverse situation as well, where a low C manager might walk in and say, I'm looking for this by the end of the week. And likely that high C individual who has the understanding of their calendar, and they know where things are going to fall within the context of their work week, that might either be enough time or might be insufficient, because again, time is however long that process that they have requires. So again, gap, because we often give what feels good to us. But when we think about this drive and we think about kind of some of the summary points here, you can think about the pace of work, the pressure at work. Is it more of that intense, I'm looking for that time crunch deadline on the low side? Or is it more of I have my steps, I have my process, let me go through it, more of a laid back approach on the high side? So that brings us to our final drive here, the D drive, which is similar to the C drive in that it also helps folks that are high in this drive to sort their world. For high C folks, it helped folks sort their world sequentially. What do I have to do first, next, and then last? For the D drive, when folks have a high amount of this, they're using that sorting mentality, not to sort sequentially, but to sort, is this thing correct or is it not? Is it right or isn't it? Is it perfect or is it not? So this drive, you may have noticed, is also about things, just like the A drive. It's not a people-related driver. And so high D folks with that need for correctness, what they tend to do is they start by defining right. And that can happen either through research, looking at how's it been done before, or it could also happen by asking questions to better understand what's expected. Now, this is a great reminder that we can't look at a behavior like asking a lot of questions and be able to kind of work backwards and say, oh, if a person's asking a lot of questions, they must be high in the D drive. Well, if you remember, there's another drive that's high and tends to ask a lot of questions as well. High A folks tend to ask a lot of questions too, right? Tell me about this, why is it this way? Same behavior of asking questions, very different underlying reasons, underlying drives. For the high A's, it's about getting that impact by taking it apart. For high D's, it's about defining what right is, so they then can focus on the details. and really make sure that what they're doing matches back to perfect. What can be motivating for folks that are high in this drive is having really clear expectations at the start of a project. The more there's understanding of what this person's being asked to do, the better they're able to define right, the more effectively they're able to monitor the details and know that they are getting close to correct and perfect. Now, if high D individuals are looking for a wealth of information to know what perfect is, know what right is, on the low side of this drive, low D individuals are likely looking for an environment with a little bit more flexibility, a little bit more of the, give me the goal and then let me kind of get there approach. Because what low D individuals are likely looking to avoid at work is really information overload, kind of being shared or told, here's the 30-page manual, and go ahead and go read through it and go and do your job as a result. And that really feeds into the gap that can happen between these two drives as well, which is all around how much information is needed to get started. High D individuals, because they're looking for that wealth or that bank of knowledge to define right, they tend to collect it and they tend to give all the information they have to other folks at the start of a project. So like that 30-page manual I was referencing a moment ago to someone that's low in the D drive, and leaving the person on the other side to ask, well, what's really important versus what are you just sharing to share? And the inverse situation can happen as well, where someone that's low in this drive might only provide high-level, minimal information to someone on the other side and say, all right, go ahead and get going, get started. And that high D individual, if they've never done it before, might have a lot of questions about what right is, what perfect looks like. And so just like the C drive, the D drive, this idea of information needed to get started is a gap because we tend to give what feels good to us to other folks. And so that can create a tension if it's not matching the same amount of information needed for someone on the other side of this drive. So when we think the D drive, think structure. Is it more of a casual, kind of giving, again, a high level of the low side of this drive? Or is it more, I'm going to be really conscientious, I'm going to follow the details on the high side? So that brings us through all of the drives. And there's one kind of final piece of new information to bring your attention to as we look at a person's whole profile, be it ourselves or other folks that we're working with. And that's the idea that we all have a reference profile that's assigned to us. There are 17 reference profiles in total. And we can think of these reference profiles as neighborhoods. They provide information about what folks, let's say, for example, who are altruists, likely are going to be motivated by, how you might want to communicate with them, how you're going to potentially want to delegate to someone that's an altruist. And so that makes them really useful, especially for managers or folks that are looking to take this information and put it into practice really quickly. The one kind of reminder, though, about reference profiles moving forward is that they are neighborhoods, not street addresses. So you can get a lot more information about a person by looking at their specific self-graph, but definitely a useful way to take some of the information that you've hopefully gleaned from this PI flyover video and go out and put it into practice by looking at reference profiles. And hopefully, in our time together today, it was a chance to really think about yourself, think about self-awareness. What are the behaviors that you likely will show up with at work? And how do you make sure you're setting yourself up to effectively choose behaviors based on what's going to get you those results you're looking for? And so thank you for taking the time to watch this flyover video. And ADVISA is looking forward to working with you more in the future to further your PI understanding.